the camp.
Right on in. It's time for the Trail Boss's Journal. Stories and lessons to give you a message of hope and brighten your day. There's coffee on the fire. Pour yourself a cup. I've just finished reading the newest entry in the Old Trail Boss's Journal. After years of nursing cows and ramrodding cowboys up the trail, the old trail boss, Pastor Jack Blease, began keeping a journal so he would remember the events and the folks who crossed his trail. If you've got just a few minutes, we'd like to share one of those stories and maybe some lessons learned. Then we'll turn to God's Word to help mark our journey and give you a little food, we call it Chuck, to think about.
Trail Boss's Journal, Trail Date, June 23rd, 1880. Location, somewhere on the trail. Dear Journal, on the Chisholm Trail this time with a mixed ownership herd. It's now a herd of about 3,000 head. That's a few more than I am really comfortable driving with the number of hands I can put together. We got kind of a late start, and many of the regular hands I had worked with in the past had already hired out to other outfits who left several weeks before we did. The ownership of this herd is the Pierce Sullivan Pasture Company. They contracted with several small ranches north of San Antonio to merge their smaller herds under the brands with the Pierce Sullivan herd. Our delay came from having to hold a larger herd as we drove the smaller groups over to the Chisholm. One of the last groups we gathered had been pastured for several weeks in a lush green meadow with lots of colorful vegetation. And by the looks of the cattle, that vegetation was very enjoyable. The mixed herds moved easily together for several weeks. After about a week of crossing into Indian territory at Doan's Crossing, it began. The hands riding drag reported that several head, maybe 4 or 5, were continually lagging behind and had to be pushed hard to keep pace with the rest of the cattle. At the same time, one of the swing riders reported that one rangy-looking steer seemed constantly agitated and aggressive to other cattle near her. When I checked which cattle they were all wearing the long H brand, the last cattle we picked up and put in the herd. Yesterday at nooning, as the cattle were being held, one of the steers the hands had pointed out suddenly broke away from the herd and started running out of control and stopped suddenly and fell. When Jake, one of the hands riding drag, reached the steer, it was dead. He rode up to me and said, "Boss, I never seen anything like that. 1 minute it was standing fine and the next minute it just went loco." When I looked at the steer, it was one of the long H herd that we had gathered off pasture. The pasture with flowering purple vegetation in the grass. Purple flowers. Loco. Of course, Oxytropis. Loco weed. Poisonous to cattle and horses. I immediately asked the hands if any of the horses had grazed in that same pasture. Loco weed, as I had heard and read, is almost always deadly to horses. The answer that came back was no. There is, at least as of now, no cure for loco weed poisoning. The only known remedy is to get the cattle off the infected pasture and wait. Some will survive. Some, such as the one today, don't. While Oxytropis isn't contagious, we immediately separated the infected cattle and held them as best we could away from the main herd. When we reach the railhead, I'll notify the owners and wait for instructions on the disposition of their herd. Dear Journal, how thankful I am that the poison that could destroy all the herd didn't. Fire's about out. Stars are shining. Time for my talk with the Lord. Loco weed. Pretty, poisonous, sometimes deadly. Bear with me this morning as I apply a little cowboy theology to the thoughts that go through my mind. I'm reminded, of course, of the story way back in the beginning of Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve and the tree in the middle of the garden. You remember this story? God had made everything, and he looked at it and saw it was good. And he spoke to Adam and Eve, and he said, "Now you can eat of anything that you want in the garden, but the fruit of the tree of knowledge you must not eat of." But the fruit was beautiful and appealing. But Satan, crafty as he is, described in Genesis as the serpent, came to them and tempted them even more. And Eve said, "Well, God said you must not eat of the tree that is in the middle of the garden." And the serpent tricked him. You remember what he said? He said, you will surely not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So Eve was tempted, and she ate, and she gave to Adam, and he ate. You remember what the result of that was? Sin came into this world, and with sin, death. See, eating of the fruit of the garden, I'm reminded a little bit of what life can be like, or what it feels like when have you ever been out in pulling weeds in the garden, and what you find is one weed is tangled into another weed, which is tangled into another. And if you don't pull those weeds when they're young and fresh, why the roots get very deep, and it gets harder and harder to pull them out and get away from that. Sin's like that, isn't it? Sometimes sin seems so tempting, and we know what's right and we know what's wrong, but the temptation is there, and suddenly we find ourselves trapped. And the more we sin, the longer it goes, the deeper the roots get, and the harder it is to get out of that. Well, praise be to God. John 15, Jesus tells us that He is the vine dresser, and that God is the vine dresser, and that God prunes the vines to take away the bad fruit and help with it. So we have a cure, the cure of Jesus Christ. We have a way out. James says, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Come near to God and he will come near to you. Trapped in sin, feeling a little bit loco sometimes because you just feel like things are out of control. No need to be poisoned to sin. No need to die in sin. The wages of sin, of course, the Bible tells us is death. But praise be to God. While we were yet sinners, why God sent His Son to die from us, to cure us from local weed poisoning and death. See you down the trail.
Well, partner, that's about it for this time. Join us right here by the campfire next time for another entry in the Old Trail Boss's Journal. And for longer dramatized versions of these and other stories, check out some of the other episodes here on the Old Trail Boss Podcast. Also, you're invited to join Pastor Jack on Sundays for Cowboy Church Live on YouTube and Facebook. Check out trailbossministry.com for more details. God bless and happy trails.